Hi, welcome. My name is Paul Buscemi, and this is Historical Perspectives. Today we're going to discuss agriculture in Ukraine and how it's been affected by the ongoing war with Russia. Now, agriculture is a big deal in Ukraine. More than 55% of Ukraine's land is fertile farmland. Agriculture provides employment for 14% of Ukraine's population, and as of now, over 20% of that workforce is out on the front line fighting the Russians. Agricultural products are Ukraine's most important export. In 2021, they totaled a $27.8 billion, accounting for 41% of the country's $68 billion in overall exports. So almost half. Now we arrived at the current year of 2023, and the amount of exports is projected to be 37% less than in 2022 and 60% less than in 2021. So in 2 years, Ukraine's agriculture sector goes from being worth 27.8 billion US dollars to 16 billion dollars. A lot of billions lost. Now, I'm sure it's obvious to those who know a thing or two about what's going on in the world right now that the culprit for this gigantic dip in agricultural output is the Russian invasion, or as some in Russia call it, the Third Patriotic War. That given title referring to Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Russia in the 1800s and the Nazi Germany invasion in the 1940s. So far, Ukraine has lost 25% of its usable farmland due to the destructive nature of the invasion. Its agriculture infrastructure has been demolished, causing water supplies to become inaccessible and contaminated. You cannot farm without access to clean water. Now, since 2022, 10 million metric tons, with some sources claiming the number to be much higher, of Ukrainian grain has been either destroyed or left to rot with no way to transport it. Not to mention a shortage in fertilizer, destroyed railways, bridges, and of course, soaring fuel prices. They're even running out of places to store the grain due to the destructive nature of the war. Anywhere there is to store grain, it's been blown up by missiles, artillery, anything the Russians can throw at it. It is Ukraine's lifeline, so if you destroy that, Ukraine's in trouble. They are in trouble. In July 2022, Russia did agree to allow Ukraine to export some of its grains in order to prevent a humanitarian disaster revolving around food shortages. They wanted to prevent that. The whole world community just looked at what Russia was doing and wagged a finger. Okay. Now, this agreement was extended in May of 2023 until the end of July, which would have allowed 22 million tons of grains to be exported. Now, that number is far below. I think 2 million or less has been exported through Ukraine, probably less. The numbers are really inaccurate, that they vary from source to source. I can't imagine the logistical cluster involved in counting these numbers. But one strange thing that I did notice is that depending on your source, it's just different. The numbers are different everywhere you go on the internet. So who really knows what's going on over there? However, this agreement was canceled just a few weeks ago. The Russians are not going to allow any more grain to be exported through the Ukraine whatsoever. Now, there have been things going on in Romania. They're trying to use Romania to channel the exports for Ukrainian farmers and their crops. However, that creates a problem because as Romania is exporting Ukrainian grain, they also need to export Romanian grain. And so right now, it's just about how fast they can export Ukrainian grain through Romania to leave time enough for the Romanian farmers to export their grain. So really, the export of Ukrainian grain has been bottlenecked by Russia. There's very small outlets to allow the export of Ukraine's most valuable resource. Now, grain is Ukraine's most important agricultural export. We know that. That includes its top four: wheat, corn, barley, canola oil. Ukrainian grain is a huge source of food to much of the world. It's also used in the creation of biofuels. It can be utilized by pharmaceutical companies, paper companies, distilleries, and even companies that produce cat litter. The stuff is everywhere. And so when millions and tons of it are just cut off from the world, it creates a chain reaction. Supply chains are affected, productions worldwide for certain items, a lot of items are halted and just dead. And it's a big issue, a ripple effect. Now, the question in my head with all this destruction, with Ukraine's economy in shambles, its exports devastated, how is it going to rebuild its agriculture sector? How is it going to get back on its own feet? Can it? Is it even possible? Now, a lot of other people, powerful people, have been asking the same question, and they have sprinted to the forefront of this tremendous issue to gain a profit because there's a lot of money to be gained in rebuilding Ukraine. Not just the agriculture sector, the whole shebang. Now, there's no way for Ukraine to ever really power up its farming industry again by itself. It will need those international companies that have arrived. The Ukrainians are going to need a lot of help. So for the overall damages brought onto Ukraine, it comes into the range of around 135 billion US dollars, and it's only rising. Of that, $2 billion has been from the destruction of its arable land. Now, the overall price of rebuilding Ukraine, just so you know, so far is $750 billion. It's almost $1 trillion. Okay, 11 billion of that would be for the agriculture sector. It could probably even more. Now, with Ukraine's economy completely dependent on foreign aid, it is of course going to have to depend on foreign intervention. This means a lot of foreign companies, and for them, like I said, it's a gold mine. People are going to be making a lot of money off this war for decades. There's Monsanto, Corteva AgroScience. Those are two American companies. I do believe actually Monsanto is owned by Bayer, which is German, but there's tons of international interest in that, including the United States. It's not just a German, solely in Germany's hands. Now, those two companies, Monsanto and Corteva AgroScience, are major players in things as pesticides and GMO crops. Both of these companies have a terrible reputation when it comes to how they deal with farmers and how they cause intense damage to the environment. We won't go too deep into this. We can, of course, go over it in another episode, and we most likely will. But right now, they are not the nicest companies to deal with. Toxic business practices that leave farmers completely dependent on them forever. It'll be no different in Ukraine. Once these players take control of Ukraine's farms, the effects will be felt throughout the country and throughout the planet. Now, as for European countries, we'll dig into a little bit of that. The European Union really hasn't focused on the rebuilding of Ukraine's agriculture sector, or really any of it. One thing that I did find was a French company by the name of CMA CGM that has proposed something called the Adriatic Land Bridge Solution, which would move Ukrainian grain from Odessa to Italy via Slovakia and Austria, and to Slovenia via Hungary. However, this plan's biggest challenge comes from all the railways that have been destroyed in Ukraine. How are you going to get it there? And again, like we mentioned, there is Romania, which is really the lifeline of Ukrainian exports right now, is Romania. If the Russians decide to blockade, again, they're not in the name of, anti-smuggling operations. That's going to be a problem, too. I don't know how they're going to do that when they see Romanian ships with Ukrainian grain on it. We'll see how they react in the next few months. Russia has been brutal when it comes to crippling Ukraine's economy. It's succeeded in doing so. It's going to be dependent on the West, and when I say the West, I really mean the United States, where the United States is writing the biggest checks. Again, Bayer's owned by Germany. There is Romania, some French companies. I'm sure there's a lot of other smaller operations, but Yeah, it's the United States is the spearhead of this rebuilding. Now, moving on, we come to China. I couldn't find anything on China rebuilding Ukraine's agriculture industry. I'm sure they're not interested in doing that, but I did learn that over 700,000 hectares, which come out to be about 9% of Ukraine's arable land, are leased to China. They leased this back in 2013. It was a 50-year deal. And currently, about 100,000 of that 700,000 hectares are in Chinese hands. So, in over 50 years, gradually more and more and more. 9% of Ukraine's arable land. Okay? I've also seen that number as high as 3 million over 50 years. Again, more convoluted numbers. From what I know, the Chinese government, I'm sure this deal is kept pretty hush hush. The details are kept from prying eyes. Now, I do have one question about that deal. Russia's destroyed lots of Ukrainian farmland, lots of their supply chains, lots of the industry. Now, with China, with some of that land in China's hands, is Russia planning on hitting any of that? Because all that China owns goes to feed China's booming, gigantic population. Okay, I do know that the Chinese leased land is located in the. Let's see if I can pronounce this right. Okay, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast of Ukraine, which is right outside of Russian-occupied Ukraine, right on the border. It has conducted missile attacks on the region's farming industry. However, these missile attacks have destroyed an abandoned poultry farm. So, really, compared to other massive destruction that the Russians have wrought upon Ukraine's agricultural sector and the country as a whole, this isn't much. So, what's in Chinese hands so far is pretty safe because it's not being used to, first of all, feed anyone but China. And Russia and China right now are buddy buddy. So, I don't see that being affected. There's really no details about these farms. It's again pretty hush hush, but my guess is that Chinese farmland in Ukraine is a no-go zone for the Russians. Like I said, the rebuilding of Ukraine's agriculture sector is most definitely in the sole custodianship of the United States. We are the bulk of the aid, and Ukraine is just its industry has been annihilated. I don't see how it's ever going to recover. Just recently, Russia announced that they are going to give 6 African countries free wheat. Free wheat. 6 of them, because Africa is the continent that is suffering the most from the Ukrainian exports being cut off from the world. Africa really depends a lot on, when you talk about breadbasket, Ukraine is Africa's breadbasket. Now, Russia has supplied 6 African countries with free grain. However, these nations are not among the most ailing from the grain shortage, although it does exist in them. The 6 nations that are receiving the free grain are also host nations to Russian military group known as Wagner, while the countries that don't host Wagner are the ones that need it the most. For example, Somalia will not be getting free grain. They will stay hungry. So a lot of more interesting facts there. Yeah. So really, the aftermath of this invasion poses an immense challenge for Ukraine's agriculture. Uh, it's going to really depend, again, I can't stress it enough, on foreign aid and international cooperation. Now, while international companies' involvement could play a crucial role, it is vital to ensure sustainable practices and minimize any adverse effects on local farmers and the environment. But with Monsanto and Corvina Agroscience, I don't see how that's going to happen. We're just going to have to monitor and to see how the developments unfold. And of course, I'll keep you informed with all the details I can grab on what's going on in Ukraine. It really is, again, I hate to be a pessimist, but I don't see the Ukrainian agriculture sector ever recovering. They used to supply 10% of the world's wheat, 14% of the world's corn. Like I said, those numbers don't exist anymore. You have the United States, Kazakhstan, Canada, Russia, all stepping up to the plate. I even noticed in the supermarket sunflower seed oil. You can't find Ukrainian sunflower seed oil. It's all from France now. So I don't, you know, Ukraine is just it's going to be, in the end it was going to be dependent because of the war. It's they don't want to be dependent on Russia, but now they're going to be dependent on the West. So I don't see how sovereignty in any way is going to be possible, especially in the agriculture sector. So it's a big deal. It's going to affect everything: food prices, food security. It's just awful. So thank you for joining us today. If you found this episode informative, remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more thought-provoking content. Feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay informed. This is Historical Perspectives with Paul Buscemi. Thank you. Goodbye.